The alarm cut through the medical bay before I even had my gloves on. I am Dr. Laura Bennett, and the first thing you need to understand about me is that I do not hesitate. Not when the console screams a code red, not when the deck shakes from an impact somewhere above us, and certainly not when a Vextari officer named Kalen Thoss is wheeled into my bay with his chest cavity torn open and 3 alien doctors standing frozen at the entrance, refusing to come any closer. "He needs immediate intervention," I said, already moving toward him. Dr. Elira Sun, the station's senior physician and a being of pale blue skin and eyes like liquid silver, put a hand out to stop me, not out of hostility, out of genuine horror. "You cannot open him," she said. "His body has not consented. This is not how healing is done." I looked down at Kalen. His breathing was shallow, uneven, the kind of breathing that tells you a person has minutes, not hours. Blood was pooling beneath him, dark and slow, the color of oil under station lighting. Whatever their customs were, whatever sacred rules governed alien medicine, none of that mattered to the clock running out in his chest. "He doesn't need to consent to staying alive," I said, and I picked up a scalpel. The room went silent, except for the monitors. I heard someone gasp behind me, a small, strangled sound, like they were watching something forbidden. Maybe they were. I didn't look back to check. I found the source of the bleeding, a ruptured vessel near what I guessed was his equivalent of a lung, and I worked. My hands moved the way they always did in moments like this, quick and certain, because thinking too much in a crisis is how people die. 10 minutes later, the bleeding had stopped. Kalen's vitals steadied. The monitor that had been flashing red now blinked a slow, calm green. I straightened up, peeled off my gloves, and turned to find every alien in the room staring at me, the way you might stare at someone who had just walked through fire and come out smiling. "He will live," I said simply. Dr. Sun did not look relieved. She looked shaken. "You cut him open," she whispered, "with your bare hands, while he could still feel it." "I gave him a local anesthetic first," I said. "He couldn't feel much." "Much?" she repeated, as if the word itself was a kind of violence. I didn't understand her reaction then, not fully. I had been on this station for 8 months, one of the first human doctors assigned to a joint medical facility shared by a dozen species, and I still hadn't learned why every alien physician treated basic surgery like something out of a nightmare. I would learn. Piece by piece, patient by patient, I would come to understand exactly why the galaxy had a very specific, very particular fear of doctors like me. But that day, all I knew was that a man who should have died was now breathing on his own, and that the people around me looked more disturbed by his survival than they would have been by his death. Kalen woke up 2 hours later. I was checking his readings when his eyes opened, silver-flecked and unfocused at first, then sharpening as he took in his surroundings. "You saved me," he said, his voice raspy. "I did my job," I said. "They told me humans were the last resort, that you would be called only if there was nothing left to try." He looked down at the neat line of sealed skin across his chest, still faintly visible beneath the regenerative dressing. I did not expect the last resort to work so quickly. "We don't waste time," I said. "Time is the one thing we can't get back." He studied me for a long moment, the way patients sometimes do when they are trying to decide whether to trust the person who just held their life in 2 hands. "Why do you not fear it?" he asked. "The blood, the cutting." "My people are taught from childhood that opening a body is opening a door that should stay closed." I thought about how to answer that. I thought about my grandmother, a rural doctor who used to tell me stories about the days before advanced diagnostics, when doctors had to make decisions with their hands and their instincts and nothing else. I thought about training exercises where instructors screamed numbers at us while we worked, teaching us to function through noise, through pressure, through the kind of situations that would send most people running. "Because closed doors don't save lives," I finally said. "Sometimes you have to go through them." Word of what happened in the medical bay spread through the station faster than any official report could have traveled. By the next day, 3 more alien crew members had specifically requested to be treated by a human doctor, while 2 others had filed a formal complaint, asking that human doctors be kept away from them entirely. It seemed the galaxy was split right down the middle on the subject of us. I found this fascinating rather than troubling. I had grown up hearing that humans were considered unusual among the species we had met, that our history, our biology, and our stubbornness set us apart. But I had never quite understood what that meant on a practical level until I watched an alien nurse nearly faint at the sight of a standard suture kit. That evening, I sat in the station's small dining hall with Daniel Hartley, a field medic who had transferred to the station around the same time I had. Daniel had spent years treating soldiers in combat zones back on Earth before joining the Interspecies Medical Corps, and if anyone understood what I was seeing, it was him. "You heard about Kalen Thoss?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Daniel smirked, cutting into something that vaguely resembled a steak but definitely was not one. "Heard about it? Half the station is talking about it. They're calling you the doctor who isn't afraid of blood." "It's strange," I said. "They act like basic trauma surgery is some kind of forbidden ritual." "For most of them, it might as well be." Daniel set down his fork. "Think about it. Every species we've met so far heals with something external. Nanite baths, regenerative fields, energy therapies that never actually touch the patient. Their whole medical tradition is built around never opening the body, never letting anyone see what's inside. To them, what you did today wasn't medicine. It was something closer to an act of faith. An act of faith in what? In the idea that you could put someone back together after taking them apart," Daniel said. "Most of these species have never seen anyone attempt that outside of extreme, controlled conditions. You did it in 10 minutes with a scalpel and a steady hand." I sat with that for a moment, turning it over in my mind. I had never thought of surgery as an act of faith. To me, it had always been the opposite, a discipline built on precision, training, and repetition, something you trusted precisely because it wasn't left to chance. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Are they going to want more humans stationed here, or fewer?" Daniel laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Both, probably. That's the thing about us, Laura. We terrify people, and we save their lives at the same time. Doesn't leave a lot of room for anything in between." I didn't fully understand what he meant, not that night. But over the following weeks, I would come to see exactly how right he was. I would see fear and gratitude living side by side in the same set of eyes, sometimes in the same patient, sometimes even in the same conversation. I would learn that the galaxy did not simply respect human doctors. It dreaded us. The same way you might dread a storm that you know, deep down, is also the only thing capable of putting out a fire. 3 days after Kalen Thoss walked out of my medical bay on his own 2 legs, a young engineer named Priya Nathan came to me with a burn injury from a coolant leak in one of the station's lower decks. Nothing serious by human standards, a second-degree burn along her forearm, painful but manageable. What surprised me was the crowd of alien crew members who gathered outside the observation window to watch me treat her. "Why is everyone staring?" Priya asked through gritted teeth as I cleaned the wound. "I think they want to see what we do without machines," I said. I finished dressing her arm, gave her instructions for aftercare, and sent her on her way. When I turned back to the window, most of the crowd had dispersed, but Dr. Sun remained, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not fear exactly. Something closer to fascination, mixed with unease, the look of someone watching a magic trick and trying to figure out if it's real. "You didn't even flinch," she said when I stepped out to speak with her. "It was a minor burn," I said. "There was nothing to flinch at." "Your patient was in pain," Dr. Sun said. I watched her face. "And you continued working as though it did not matter." "It mattered," I said carefully. "But stopping wouldn't have helped her. Sometimes, the fastest way through pain is the kindest one." Dr. Sun was quiet for a long moment. On my world, we would have sedated her fully before beginning. We would have waited until she felt nothing at all. "That takes time you don't always have," I said. "On the battlefield, in an emergency, you don't always get to wait." "Is that where your medicine comes from?" she asked. "Your battlefields?" I thought about that question for longer than I expected to. Some of it, yes. A lot of what we know about saving lives, we learned in the worst possible circumstances. We didn't have the luxury of waiting for perfect conditions. We had wounded people and not enough time, so we learned to work fast, and we learned to work through things that would stop most other doctors. "That is what frightens us," Dr. Sun admitted, her voice quiet, almost confessional. "Not that you are skilled. that you have made peace with something the rest of us have spent generations trying to avoid. I didn't have an answer for that, not right away. I only knew that somewhere far from this station, on a planet most of my alien colleagues had never seen and could not fully imagine, humanity had built its medicine out of necessity rather than comfort. We hadn't had the luxury of pristine, painless healing. We'd had scarcity, urgency, and an unshakable refusal to let people die, simply because saving them was difficult. That refusal, I was beginning to understand, was exactly what made us so unsettling to everyone else in the galaxy. Over the following week, my reputation on the station continued to grow, though grow is perhaps too gentle a word. It spread more like a rumor spreads, shifting shape as it passed from crew member to crew member, gaining details that weren't quite true, and losing ones that were. By the end of the week, I had heard 3 different versions of the Kalen Thoss incident, one of which claimed I had operated on him without any anesthetic at all, and another that insisted I had somehow predicted the internal bleeding before it happened. None of it was accurate, but all of it pointed toward the same underlying truth. Something about the way I practiced medicine had unsettled an entire station full of beings from a dozen different worlds, and none of them could quite look away from it. Kalen himself sought me out before he was discharged, finding me in the small office attached to the medical bay, where I kept my records and, more often than not, ate my meals between shifts. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, standing a little stiffly in the doorway, "before I returned to my duties." "You don't need to thank me," I said. "It's what I'm here for." "My people do not typically survive injuries like mine," he said, "not on a timeline that fast. We would have moved me to a full medical facility, prepared the necessary equipment, gathered the required consent from my family line. By the time all of that was finished, I likely would have died." "Then I'm glad I didn't wait," I said. Kalen nodded slowly, his silver eyes studying me with the same careful curiosity I had seen in Dr. Sun. "There is a word my people use for doctors like you. It does not translate perfectly, but the closest meaning is something like storm healer, one who saves you by becoming, for a short time, something dangerous." "Dangerous," I repeated. "Not to your patients," he clarified quickly. "To the stillness. To the waiting. You do not wait, Dr. Bennett. And on a world where waiting has always meant safety, that makes you very hard to understand." He left not long after that, walking out of the medical bay under his own power, fully healed, fully alive. I stood there for a long moment after the door closed behind him, thinking about the word he had used, storm healer. I turned it over in my mind, testing its weight, and found that I didn't mind it at all. If saving lives meant becoming a kind of storm, then I decided I was perfectly willing to be one. That night, as the station cycled into its dimmed evening lighting, I sat alone in the medical bay, reviewing Kalen's discharge notes and thinking about everything Dr. Sun had said. Fear and gratitude, living side by side. A galaxy full of beings who needed exactly what humans could offer, even as that same offering terrified them down to their bones. I didn't know it yet, but Kalen Thoss's case was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, I would be called upon to do far stranger things than open a wounded man's chest. I would be asked to bring the dead back to life, to inflict controlled pain in the name of healing, to make impossible choices in the middle of chaos, and to defy the very customs of entire civilizations in order to save a single life that everyone else had already given up on. Each time, the same pattern would repeat. Shock, disbelief, and then, slowly, an uneasy kind of trust that no other species in the galaxy seemed to offer quite the way we did. I didn't understand, not fully, what all of this would eventually mean, both for me and for the growing reputation of every human doctor serving among the stars. But I understood enough to know that something had shifted the moment I picked up that scalpel and stepped toward Kalen Thoss, instead of stepping back. Word was already traveling faster than any transport ship. On a dozen different worlds, in a dozen different languages, the same story was beginning to spread, whispered between physicians who had never met a human before and now weren't sure they wanted to. There was a new kind of doctor in the galaxy now, one who did not flinch, did not wait, and did not accept the idea that some things simply could not be fixed. And somewhere out among the stars, entire species were beginning to understand exactly why that terrified them. The story of what happened next, the story of the day I first stopped a man's heart in order to save it, would only make that fear grow deeper. But that is a story for what came after. When I learned that saving a life sometimes means embracing the one thing every other species in the galaxy had spent their entire history trying to avoid. Death itself, held for a moment, and then reversed. The first time I saw an alien doctor refuse to touch a human patient, I didn't understand what I was looking at. That changed the day Daniel Hartley took a plasma burn to the shoulder during a routine cargo transfer, and I found myself standing in a hallway, arguing with 3 different physicians about whether human medicine could even be trusted to work. It happened almost a year into my posting, long before Kalen Thoss and the incident that made my name known across half the station. I want to go back to it now, because to understand why human doctors are feared, you first have to understand how we arrived among the stars in the first place, and how badly that first arrival went. Humanity did not enter galactic medicine quietly. We entered it the way we enter most things, without much patience for tradition, and even less patience for waiting around while someone died of something we knew how to fix. The joint medical program had only been running for a few months when I was assigned to Meridian Station, a research and diplomatic outpost shared by 7 different species. I was young, freshly transferred from an emergency trauma unit back on Earth, and I had no idea that the very first procedure I performed on this station would become something of a local legend, retold in exaggerated form for years afterward. A Vantori diplomat named Celis Rowe had collapsed during a trade negotiation. Cardiac arrest, as close as I could translate the diagnosis into human terms. His body had simply stopped, right there at the negotiating table, in front of representatives from 4 different worlds. The station's resident physician, a Vantori named Dr. Carell Amos, was already kneeling beside him when I arrived, running a diagnostic scanner over his chest and murmuring something in a low, mournful tone that I didn't need a translator to understand as grief. "What's his status?" I asked, dropping to my knees on the other side of the body. "He has passed," Dr. Amos said. "There is nothing more to be done." I checked the scanner readout myself. No heartbeat, yes, but no catastrophic organ failure either. No injury severe enough to explain a permanent loss of life. Just a stopped heart, sitting quietly in a chest that was, as far as I could tell, otherwise intact.
"He hasn't passed,"
I said. "His heart stopped. That's different." Dr. Amos looked at me the way you might look at someone who had just said something deeply, profoundly strange. A stopped heart means the body has ended its function. There is a difference between illness and the natural conclusion of a life. "Not always," I said, already positioning my hands over Celis Rowe's chest. "Sometimes a stopped heart is just a heart that needs a reason to start again." I began compressions. I remember the sound the room made, a collective intake of breath from every alien delegate watching, as if I had just done something deeply disrespectful, rather than something that might save a life. Dr. Amos reached for my arm, tried to pull me back, insisting that what I was doing was a violation of the dead. I kept working. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, repeat. The rhythm my instructors had drilled into me until it lived somewhere below conscious thought. On the 4th cycle, Celis Rowe's chest rose on its own, his eyes opened, and every alien in that room recoiled, as though they had just witnessed something forbidden crawl its way back through a door that should have stayed shut forever. That was the moment, I think, when the galaxy first understood what human doctors were capable of, and the moment it first understood how deeply that capability frightened them. Celis Rowe survived. He returned to his negotiations 3 days later, fully recovered, with no memory of the minutes his heart had spent silent. But the story of what happened followed me for the rest of my posting, retold and reshaped with each passing month, until eventually it reached other stations, other species, other doctors, who had never even met a human, but had already decided they wanted nothing to do with whatever it was we practiced. I didn't understand the depth of that reaction until Daniel explained it to me over dinner one evening, not long after I had transferred to Meridian permanently. "Most species we've met treat death the way we treat sunset," he said. "It's an event. Something final, something clean. One moment there is light, and then there isn't, and nobody expects the sun to come back up an hour later just because you wanted it to." "Death isn't always final," I said. Sometimes it's reversible, if you act fast enough. You know that. I know that. Every human doctor knows that. Daniel leaned back in his chair. But to them, what we call resuscitation looks a lot more like resurrection, and resurrection isn't medicine to most of the galaxy. It's closer to a violation of the natural order. I thought about Celis Rowe's face when he opened his eyes, confused and disoriented, surrounded by delegates who looked at him like he was something new, something that shouldn't exist. I thought about Dr. Amos, who had refused to speak to me for nearly 2 weeks after the incident, unable to reconcile what he had witnessed with everything his own medical training had taught him. Is that why some of them avoid us? I asked. Some of them avoid us because they think we're dangerous, Daniel said. Not cruel, not malicious, dangerous, the way fire is dangerous, useful, powerful, and capable of doing something most of them were taught never to attempt. It took me a long time to fully understand what Daniel meant, but understanding came, piece by piece, patient by patient. I began noticing the way certain alien crew members watched me in the hallways, the same mixture of curiosity and unease I had seen on Dr. Amos's face. I began noticing how often human doctors were called only after every other option had already failed, as though we were some kind of last resort rather than a first choice. And I began to notice something else, something that took much longer to recognize. Every time a human doctor succeeded where the alien medical establishment had already given up, the request for human medicine on that world quietly increased, even as the fear surrounding it grew right alongside it. A few months after the Celis Rowe incident, I was called to assist with a mass evacuation from a damaged mining platform on the edge of the system. Nearly 40 workers had been exposed to a toxic gas leak, and the platform's own medical staff, a small team of Corvi physicians, had already made their triage decisions before the human relief team even arrived. We have stabilized who we could, the lead Corvi physician told me, a tired-looking being named Tessa Vrel, her 4 eyes ringed with exhaustion. The rest are beyond recovery. We are simply making them comfortable. I walked through the makeshift medical bay they had set up, checking readouts on patients who had already been marked, quietly and without ceremony, as beyond saving. Several of them were still breathing. A few were even conscious, staring up at the ceiling, with the particular stillness of people who had already been told there was nothing left to do for them. This one, I said, stopping beside a young worker whose readings showed severe respiratory damage, but a heartbeat that was, against all expectation, still strong. Why has he been marked as beyond recovery? The toxin has damaged his lungs beyond our ability to repair, Tessa said. Without functioning lungs, there is no path forward. There's always a path forward, I said, as long as the heart is still beating. I called for the emergency ventilation equipment we had brought with us, portable systems designed to breathe for a patient whose own lungs could no longer manage the task. Tessa watched, arms crossed, as I fitted the mask over the young worker's face and began the slow, careful process of forcing air into lungs that had been declared finished only minutes earlier. You are prolonging his suffering, she said quietly. There is no dignity in refusing to let a body rest when it has already tried to stop. There's no dignity in giving up when there's still a chance, I said. I'm not prolonging anything. I'm buying him time until his lungs can heal, or until we can get him somewhere with better equipment than what either of us has out here. The worker's name, I would later learn, was Corin Vale, and he survived. It took 11 days in a proper medical facility, 3 separate treatments to repair the damage the toxin had caused, and more patients than either Tessa or I had expected to need. But he survived, walked out under his own power, and returned to work on a different platform less than 2 months later. Tessa sought me out before I left the mining platform, standing in the doorway of the medical bay with an expression I had, by then, learned to recognize. Not quite fear, not quite gratitude. Something suspended uneasily between the two. We do not disagree on wanting to save lives, Dr. Bennett, she said. We disagree on when it is acceptable to stop trying. Then maybe that's the difference between us, I said. I don't think there's ever a moment when it's acceptable to stop, as long as there's still a chance, however small. That is what frightens my people about yours, Tessa admitted. You do not seem to believe in limits, and a being who does not believe in limits is very difficult to predict. I didn't have a response for that, not one I felt confident giving. I only knew that somewhere, deep in the history that had shaped human medicine, We had learned a lesson that most of the galaxy had never needed to learn. We had learned it in overcrowded emergency rooms, on battlefields, in disaster zones where the difference between life and death often came down to a single decision made in a fraction of a second. We had learned that giving up too early was its own kind of failure, one that haunted the people who made that choice far longer than any difficult, uncertain fight ever did. That lesson had shaped us into doctors who refused to accept the word impossible, doctors who treated every stopped heart as a problem to be solved, rather than an ending to be respected. And across a galaxy full of species who had built their medicine around gentleness, patience, and acceptance, that refusal made us something entirely new, something powerful, something useful in the worst possible moments, and something, as I was slowly beginning to understand, that an enormous number of beings across the stars had already learned to fear. By the time I returned to Meridian Station after the mining platform evacuation, the story of Corin Vale's recovery had already begun circulating, joining the growing collection of tales about what human doctors were willing to do when everyone else had already stopped trying. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was tired, running on too little sleep and too much recycled coffee, and all I wanted was a few hours of quiet before my next shift began. I got almost none of it. Within an hour of docking, I was called to the medical bay for an emergency, involving a young Vantori technician named Selah Doss, whose reaction to the events that followed would teach me something I hadn't yet learned about the price of being the kind of doctor who never stops. But that, too, is a story for later. What matters here, what I want you to understand before we go any further, is this. By the end of my first year among the stars, I had already stopped someone's heart to save it, forced air into lungs that had been declared finished, and refused to accept a single diagnosis of impossible from doctors far more experienced in their own worlds than I would ever be in mine. I had become, without fully realizing it, exactly the kind of doctor the galaxy had started to whisper about. And the whispers, as I would soon discover, were only getting louder. Selah Doss had inhaled a coolant vapor during a routine maintenance shift, nothing that should have been life-threatening on its own. But something in her physiology reacted badly to the exposure, and by the time she reached the medical bay, her body had begun shutting down, in a way that none of our scanners had ever recorded before. I remember the exact moment her heart stopped. I remember the flat, unbroken tone of the monitor, and I remember the way every alien nurse in the room froze, waiting to see what I would do, as though they already knew, even before I moved, that I wasn't going to simply let her go. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that saving Selah Doss would require something far more drastic than the compressions I had used on Celis Rowe months earlier. Her body was rejecting its own blood, a toxic reaction to the coolant that was spreading faster than any conventional treatment could counter. There was only one option left, and it was one that even I hesitated to consider. I would need to stop her heart completely, on purpose, and hold it still long enough to flush the toxin from her system before restarting it again. "You cannot be serious," said Dr. Amos, who had been assigned to assist me that day, his voice rising in a way I had never heard from him before. "You want to kill her, in order to save her." "I want to buy her body a few minutes without a pulse," I said, already preparing the equipment. "Long enough to clear the toxin before it reaches her brain." "That is not medicine," he said. "That is gambling with a life that has already been given to us to protect." "I'm not gambling," I said. "I've done the calculations. If we don't stop her heart, the toxin reaches her brain in under 2 minutes, and there's nothing either of us can do after that. If we do stop it, we have a window, small but real, to clear her system and bring her back." Dr. Amos stared at me, and for a long moment, I thought he might refuse to help entirely. Then, slowly, he nodded, though his hands trembled as he moved to assist. I administered the medication that would still her heart, watched the monitor flatten into a single unbroken line, and began the delicate process of filtering the toxin from her bloodstream through the emergency systems we had on hand. Every second felt impossibly long. I was aware, distantly, of the small crowd that had gathered outside the observation window, alien faces pressed close to the glass, watching in a silence that felt less like respect and more like witnessing something they had been taught their entire lives to fear. At the 90-second mark, I administered the reversal medication and began compressions. Nothing happened. I kept going, counting under my breath, feeling the weight of every eye in that room pressing down on me, even as I refused to let it distract me from the rhythm my hands already knew by heart. At the 2-minute and 12-second mark, the monitor beeped once, then twice, then settled into a steady, healthy rhythm. Sela Doss's chest rose on its own. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and disoriented, the same way Celis Rose had months earlier. The silence that followed was different from any silence I had experienced before. It wasn't relief. It wasn't celebration. It was something closer to shock, an entire room full of beings trying to process what they had just witnessed. I had taken a living person, stopped the function that most of them considered the very definition of life, held her in that stillness on purpose, and then brought her back, as though it were simply another step in a procedure, rather than the crossing of some sacred unspoken line. Dr. Amos didn't speak to me for the rest of that shift. When he finally did, 3 days later, his words stayed with me longer than almost anything else anyone said to me during my entire posting on Meridian Station. "I have practiced medicine for 40 years, he said. "I have never, not once, considered stopping a heart on purpose as anything other than an ending. You did it, as though it were simply another tool in your kit." "It is," I said. "Sometimes stopping something is the only way to save it." "That is a very human way of thinking," he said, and I couldn't tell, even after months of working alongside him, whether he meant it as an insult or as something closer to reluctant admiration. I have thought about that conversation many times since. I have come to believe it was both. The story of Sela Doss's recovery spread even faster than the ones before it, and this time, the reaction was sharper, more divided. Some crew members began requesting human doctors specifically for emergency situations, trusting that we would exhaust every option before accepting defeat. Others began requesting, just as specifically, that human doctors be kept away from them entirely, unwilling to risk becoming the subject of a procedure that violated everything they had been taught to believe about the sanctity of a single, unbroken life. I understood both reactions, even as I couldn't fully share either one. To me, what I had done wasn't a violation of anything. It was simply medicine, practiced with the same precision and discipline I had learned during years of training back on Earth, adapted to whatever the situation required. But I had begun to understand, slowly and with growing clarity, that precision and discipline meant something very different to me than it did to almost every other species I had encountered so far. A few weeks later, I was approached by a Corvi researcher named Ilan Bren, who had heard about Sela Doss's case through the network of rumors that seemed to travel faster than any official report ever could. "I have a question," he said, finding me during one of my rare breaks in the station's small observation deck. "When you stopped her heart, were you afraid?" I considered the question carefully before answering. I was afraid of failing. I wasn't afraid of the method itself. "That is the part my people cannot understand," Ilan said. "We are taught, from the moment we begin our medical studies, that death is not something to be handled casually. It is not a tool. It is an ending that deserves respect, even reverence. What you did, treated it as neither." "I don't think I treated it casually," I said. "I understood exactly what I was risking. I just didn't let that stop me from trying." "That is the difference," Ilan said quietly. "Not that you are careless, that you are willing to walk directly into the thing the rest of us have spent our entire history trying to avoid, and you do it without losing yourself in the process." I sat with his words long after he left, turning them over the way I had turned over Kalen Thoss's phrase months earlier. Storm healer. One who saves you by becoming, for a short time, something dangerous. I was beginning to understand exactly what that meant, and exactly why it unsettled so many of the people I worked alongside every day. Human medicine, I realized, had never been built around the idea of respecting death. It had been built around the idea of defeating it, delaying it, outrunning it, for as long as humanly possible, using every tool available, and inventing new ones when the old ones weren't enough. That philosophy had shaped generations of doctors back on Earth. Doctors who saw a stopped heart not as a conclusion, but as a problem with a potential solution. Doctors who had learned, through centuries of trial and failure, that giving up too soon was its own kind of unforgivable mistake. Out here, among species who had built their medicine around gentler principles, that philosophy made us look less like healers and more like beings who had made peace with something they should never have been willing to touch. And yet, for every alien who recoiled from what I did, there was another who sought me out specifically because of it. Word had begun to spread beyond Meridian Station, carried by traders, diplomats, and crew members transferring between postings, until eventually it reached ears far beyond anything I could have anticipated when I first stepped off the transport ship that brought me here. Human doctors, the stories said, did not accept the word impossible. Human doctors would stop your heart if it meant saving your life. Human doctors did things that violated the deepest, oldest traditions of galactic medicine, and somehow, more often than anyone expected, those doctors were right to do it. I didn't fully understand the weight of that reputation until an emergency request arrived from a distant outpost nearly 2 weeks later, one that would force me to confront exactly how far I was willing to go, and exactly how much an entire civilization was willing to risk, in order to save a single life that had already been declared beyond saving by everyone else who had tried. That request would take me further from Meridian Station than I had ever traveled, into territory where the fear surrounding human medicine ran deeper than anything I had encountered so far, and where the line between saving a life and defying an entire culture's most sacred beliefs would blur in ways I never expected. But that story, the story of what happened when an entire species was forced to choose between their oldest traditions and their newest hope, belongs to what came next. Pain is a subject most species in the galaxy prefer not to discuss, let alone witness. I learned this lesson properly the day Daniel Hartley took a plasma burn to his shoulder during a cargo transfer gone wrong. An injury that, by human standards, was painful but entirely manageable. By the standards of everyone else watching, it was something closer to a spectacle. The transfer accident happened in one of the station's lower cargo bays, a malfunctioning coupling releasing a burst of superheated plasma that caught Daniel across the shoulder before the automatic containment field engaged. He walked into the medical bay on his own power, one hand pressed against the burn, his jaw tight but his voice steady. "Don't fuss over me," he said, before I had even gotten a proper look at the wound. "Just clean it up, and I'll be back on shift by tomorrow." The burn was serious, a deep second-degree injury that would need careful cleaning, debridement, and dressing before it could begin healing properly. I told him as much, and I told him it was going to hurt, more than he probably wanted it to, because the portable anesthetic we had on hand wouldn't be enough to fully numb an injury of that depth without risking his ability to remain alert and mobile. "Do what you need to do," he said, settling onto the examination table. "I've had worse." What followed was, by human standards, a fairly ordinary procedure. Daniel gritted his teeth, cracked a few dry jokes to distract himself, and let me work through the cleaning and dressing process without complaint, even as sweat beaded across his forehead from the effort of staying still. It was the kind of quiet endurance I had seen 100 times before, the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that pain was simply something to be managed, rather than something to be feared. I hadn't noticed the small crowd gathering outside the observation window until I finished the dressing and looked up to find nearly a dozen alien crew members watching, several of them with expressions I can only describe as deeply distressed. Nurse Corin Tall, a young Vantari assisting me that day, looked pale, her 4 fingers gripping the edge of the supply cart so tightly the knuckles had shifted to a lighter shade. "Is he in significant pain?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I said honestly. "But he's managing it." "How can he manage something like that?" she asked. He was speaking, making sounds that resembled amusement. I looked over at Daniel, who was indeed still cracking jokes despite the raw, freshly dressed burn across his shoulder. "That's how he copes with it. Humor helps some people get through pain." Corin Tall shook her head slowly, unable to hide her unease. "On my world, physicians would never allow a patient to remain conscious through an injury of that severity. We consider it a failure of care, allowing someone to suffer when relief is available. The relief we had available wasn't enough to fully numb him without risking complications," I explained. "Sometimes the choice isn't between pain and no pain. It's between manageable pain and something worse." "And he accepted that choice willingly?" she asked. "He did," I said. "Most humans would." Corin looked at me, as though I had just described something entirely alien to her, which, I suppose, From her perspective, I had. That evening, after Daniel had been discharged with instructions to rest and return the following day for a follow-up, I found myself thinking about Corin's reaction and about the small crowd that had gathered to watch a procedure that, to me, had seemed almost routine. It wasn't the first time I had noticed this particular pattern. Alien crew members reacted to human displays of pain tolerance with a discomfort that went far beyond simple squeamishness. It was something closer to genuine distress, the kind of reaction you might expect from witnessing an act of self-harm, rather than a routine medical procedure. I brought this up with Daniel the next day, during his follow-up appointment. "They think we're either heroic or completely broken," he said, wincing slightly as I checked the healing progress on his shoulder. "There's not much room in their heads for a middle option." "Why does it bother them so much?" I asked. "Pain is just pain. We feel it the same way they do." "Maybe," Daniel said, "but most of them have built entire civilizations around avoiding it whenever possible. Their medicine, their culture, probably even their day-to-day lives. From what I've read, most of these species consider visible suffering to be something close to a moral failure, either on the part of the person experiencing it or the person allowing it to happen. So when they see us tolerate it," I said slowly, working through the logic, "they don't see strength. They see something closer to a warning sign." "That's about the size of it," Daniel said. "To them, someone who can smile through a plasma burn either has an extraordinarily high threshold for suffering, or something is fundamentally wrong with the way they process it. Either option is unsettling if you've spent your whole life believing pain should be avoided at nearly any cost." I thought about the soldiers and emergency responders I had trained alongside back on Earth, the ones who could carry on a conversation while a medic worked on a wound serious enough to end most ordinary days entirely. I thought about my own training, the countless hours spent learning to function through discomfort, exhaustion, and stress, because the alternative, freezing up when it mattered most, was simply not an option in the kind of work we did. "It's not that we don't feel it," I said finally. "We just don't let it stop us." "Try explaining that to someone who's never had to develop that particular skill," Daniel said. "To them, it looks less like discipline and more like a species that's forgotten how to be afraid." The incident with Daniel wasn't isolated. Over the following weeks, I noticed the pattern repeating itself with almost every human patient who came through the medical bay, regardless of the severity of their injury. A minor cut that a human would barely acknowledge drew concerned glances from alien crew members. A broken bone, set and splinted while the patient remained fully conscious and largely composed, drew outright alarm. The situation came to a head during a training exercise gone wrong, when a young human engineer named Owen Whitfield suffered a serious fracture in his leg after a support strut gave way beneath him. The injury was severe, complicated by the awkward angle of the fall, and by the time he reached the medical bay, the pain must have been considerable. Owen, true to form, spent most of the procedure asking me questions about the medical equipment I was using, genuinely curious despite the circumstances, pausing only occasionally to grit his teeth through a particularly sharp adjustment. Dr. Sun happened to be present that day, observing from across the room as I worked. When I finally finished setting the fracture and preparing it for the healing accelerator, she approached me with an expression that had, by then, become familiar. Not quite horror, something closer to a deeply unsettled fascination. "He asked you questions," she said, glancing toward Owen, who was now resting comfortably, already discussing something unrelated with Corin Tall. "During the procedure, he asked about the equipment." "He's curious by nature," I said. "Pain doesn't usually stop that." "On my world," Dr. Sun said slowly, "an injury of that severity would leave a patient unable to speak, let alone maintain a conversation. We would consider it deeply irregular for someone to remain so composed." "He's not suppressing anything," I said. "He's genuinely handling it. That's different from pretending it doesn't hurt." "How do you know the difference?" she asked. It was a fair question, and one I had to think about before answering. "Because I've seen both. I've seen patients pretend they're fine when they're not, and it usually shows in small ways, in their breathing, in how they hold themselves. Owen isn't pretending. He's just built a tolerance most people don't have." Dr. Sun was quiet for a long moment, watching Owen from across the room with an expression that had shifted, subtly, from unease into something closer to genuine curiosity. Is this tolerance something all humans share, or is he simply unusual among your kind? Somewhere in between, I said. Most of us can manage more than we think we can, especially in an emergency. Some of us, through training or experience, can manage quite a bit more than that. It is a strange kind of strength, Dr. Sun said finally. One that seems to come with a cost most of my people would not be willing to pay. I didn't disagree with her. I understood, even then, that our relationship with pain had been shaped by circumstances most of the species we had encountered so far had never needed to face. We had built our medicine, and much of our resilience, in conditions that demanded a certain willingness to push through discomfort in order to survive. Whether on ancient battlefields, in overcrowded hospitals during periods of crisis, or simply in the ordinary, unglamorous grind of human history, which had rarely offered the luxury of avoiding pain altogether. That willingness, that quiet, stubborn refusal to let suffering dictate our actions, was, I was beginning to understand, one of the primary reasons human doctors had earned such a complicated reputation among the stars. We were not simply skilled. We were, in the eyes of nearly every species we had encountered, disturbingly comfortable with something they had spent generations trying to avoid entirely. It would not be the last time that particular trait defined how I was seen, both by my colleagues and by the patients who found themselves, willingly or otherwise, under my care. And it would not be the last time that trait proved to be exactly what saved a life that every other option had already failed to save. The next test of that trait, and the reputation it had built for me, and for every human doctor serving among the stars, would come sooner than I expected, in the form of a crisis that would force me to make decisions no gentle, careful tradition had ever prepared its physicians to make. The distress call reached Meridian Station just after midnight, station time. Though out among the stars, time only ever meant whatever the nearest clock decided it meant. A transport vessel carrying nearly 60 passengers had suffered a catastrophic hull breach after colliding with debris in an unmapped section of the trade corridor. Casualties were extensive. The vessel's own medical staff, a small team of 2 Corvi physicians, had already been overwhelmed before we even arrived. I was part of the emergency response team dispatched to assist, along with Daniel Hartley and 3 other medical personnel, human and alien alike. What greeted us when we boarded the damaged vessel was the kind of scene that no amount of training ever fully prepares you for, though my training had prepared me better than most. Bodies, injured and otherwise, filled the vessel's main corridor in overwhelming numbers. The 2 Corvi physicians who had been managing the crisis alone looked utterly depleted, moving between patients with the particular slow exhaustion of people who had long since run out of clear answers. "We need to establish triage immediately," I said, already surveying the scene, sorting patients in my mind by severity, urgency, and likelihood of survival. One of the Corvi physicians, a trembling, exhausted being named Doran Vey, looked at me with something close to desperation. "We do not have a system for this. Our medicine does not typically require choosing between patients. We simply treat whoever needs treatment, in the order they arrive." "That works when you have time and resources," I said. "You don't have either right now. We need to prioritize who can be saved, and in what order, or we're going to lose people we didn't have to lose." "Choosing who receives care and who does not," Doran said slowly, "is not something my training prepared me to do." I understood, in that moment, exactly what I was asking of him, and exactly why it terrified him so deeply. Triage, the practice of sorting patients based on urgency and likelihood of survival, rather than order of arrival or severity alone, was second nature to me, drilled into every human emergency physician through years of training, and, more often than any of us like to admit, real-world experience with mass casualty events. It was not, apparently, second nature to a species whose medical technology had rarely, if ever, forced them into a situation where resources ran out before patients did. I didn't have time to ease him into the concept gently. I began sorting patients myself, quick, decisive assessments made in seconds rather than minutes, directing the response team toward those who could be saved with immediate intervention, marking others for delayed treatment once the initial crisis had stabilized, and, in the hardest cases, acknowledging, with a clarity that still haunts me when I let myself think about it too long, that some injuries were simply beyond what we could manage in the time and conditions available. "This one first," I called out, kneeling beside a young Vantari passenger with a severe chest injury, directing Daniel toward her with quick, clipped instructions. "This one can wait 10 minutes, I said of another, a passenger with a broken arm and minor lacerations, stable enough to survive the delay. And then, harder than either of those decisions, I moved past a passenger whose injuries were too severe for the resources we had on hand, a decision made in less than 3 seconds, filed away to be revisited, only if time allowed, which, given the scale of the crisis, I already suspected it would not. Doran Vey watched this entire process unfold with an expression of growing horror. "You decided, in moments, who lives and who does not," he said, his voice unsteady. "How do you carry a choice like that?" "You carry it because the alternative is worse," I said, already moving to the next patient. "If I spend equal time on everyone, more people die waiting than would die from the choices I'm making now." "But how do you know you are choosing correctly?" he pressed. "I don't, not always," I admitted. "But acting on the best judgment available beats freezing up and losing everyone to indecision. That's the whole point of triage. It's not perfect. It's just better than the alternative." We worked for hours, human and alien medical personnel side by side, though the working styles could not have been more different. Daniel and I moved quickly, decisively, making rapid assessments and adjusting course as new information came in. The Corvi physicians, even once they began following our lead, moved with a visible reluctance, each decision weighing on them in a way that seemed to slow their reactions, even as the crisis demanded speed above nearly everything else. By the time the last patient had been stabilized and the vessel's more severe cases had been transferred to Meridian Station's full medical facility, we had saved 47 of the 60 passengers aboard. It was, by any objective measure, a successful response to an overwhelming crisis. But the cost of those decisions, the choices made in seconds rather than minutes, weighed differently on everyone involved. Doran Vey found me afterward, sitting alone in a quiet corner of the transport vessel's now largely empty corridor, taking the first real break either of us had gotten in over 6 hours. "You saved 47 lives today," he said, settling carefully into the seat across from me. "We lost 13, I said. "You say that as though it outweighs the 47 you saved." "It doesn't outweigh it," I said. "But it doesn't disappear either. Every triage decision I made today, I'll remember. Not because I regret them, because forgetting them would mean not taking them seriously enough in the first place." Doran was quiet for a long moment, processing something I couldn't quite read in his expression. "My people do not train for this kind of choice," he said finally. "Our medicine has always assumed that with enough time, enough resources, everyone can eventually be saved. We have never needed to develop what you have, the ability to choose, quickly, without being consumed by the weight of that choice." "I wouldn't say we're not consumed by it," I said. "We just don't let it stop us from making the next decision, and the one after that. There isn't time to process it in the moment. That comes later, if it comes at all." "That is what unsettles my people most about your medicine," Doran admitted. "Not the cutting, not the stopped hearts, not even the pain you seem so willing to endure. It is this, the willingness to choose, so quickly, who receives your effort and who does not. It suggests a kind of practical understanding of loss that most of us have never needed to develop." I thought about that phrase for a long time afterward, a practical understanding of loss. It was, I realized, a fairly accurate description of something that had shaped human medicine for centuries, long before any of us had ever imagined healing patients from other worlds. Scarcity had taught us that lesson, over and over, through wars, through disasters, through ordinary days in overcrowded emergency rooms, where the number of patients always seemed to outpace the number of hands available to treat them. We had learned to make hard choices quickly, not because we valued life any less than the species we now worked alongside, but because we had learned, through difficult experience, that hesitation in the face of scarcity often cost more lives than decisive, imperfect action ever did. That lesson, so deeply embedded in human medicine that most of us barely thought about it consciously anymore, was, I was beginning to understand, one of the most unsettling things about us to nearly everyone else in the galaxy. It wasn't the blood, or the pain, or even the willingness to stop a heart in order to save it. It was the fact that we could look at an impossible situation, make a decision in seconds, and keep moving forward, without losing ourselves entirely in the weight of what that decision meant. The story of the transport vessel rescue spread through the medical community even faster than the stories before it, carried by the two Corvi physicians who had witnessed it firsthand, and by the survivors themselves, who spoke, with a mixture of gratitude and lingering unease, about the human doctors who had sorted through their crisis with a speed and certainty that felt almost inhuman. I didn't think of what I had done as inhuman. I thought of it as necessary, the same practical, unglamorous kind of necessity that had shaped human medicine since long before any of us had left our home world behind. But I was beginning to understand, more clearly with each passing case, that necessity looked very different, depending on which side of the examination table you were standing on. Not long after the transport vessel incident, a request arrived that would test everything I had learned so far, not in the chaos of a mass casualty event, but in the quiet, deliberate defiance of an entire culture's oldest beliefs about what could and could not be treated. An alien dignitary was dying of a condition his own people considered untreatable, a fate his culture had long since accepted as inevitable, and somewhere in the quiet certainty that had carried me through every difficult decision so far, I would find myself once again refusing to accept the word impossible, even when the person standing in front of me had already made peace with it themselves. Ambassador Doran Kest arrived at Meridian Station in the final stages of a condition his own physicians called the quiet fading, a slow, progressive failure of the organ system his species relied upon to regulate internal temperature and energy distribution. By the time his transport reached us, he had less than 2 weeks left, according to every scan his personal physicians had already run. He came to the station not for treatment, but for what his culture called a dignified conclusion, a tradition among his people that involved spending one's final days somewhere significant, surrounded by advisors and family, formally closing out the responsibilities of a long and, in his case, distinguished diplomatic career. I met him during a routine check performed on all incoming dignitaries, a standard procedure meant to catch anything that might require attention during their stay. What I found instead was a condition that, while unfamiliar to me in its specific biological details, bore a striking resemblance to certain organ failure patterns I had studied extensively during my training, patterns that, in humans, would have been treatable with the right combination of mechanical support and surgical intervention. "This has been declared untreatable," I said carefully, reviewing his scans in the small consultation room adjoining the medical bay, "by your own physicians." "It is untreatable," Ambassador Kest said, his voice calm, resigned in a way that suggested he had long since made peace with his fate. "My people's medicine does not possess a method for repairing this particular system once it has begun to fail. It is a known limitation of our biology, one we have understood and accepted for generations." "I'd like to examine the scans more closely," I said. "If you're willing." He studied me for a long moment, his expression difficult to read. "Dr. Bennett, I am aware of your reputation, the doctor who does not accept limits. I mean no disrespect when I say that some limits exist for reasons beyond simple lack of effort." "I understand that," I said. "I still think it's worth looking closely before accepting that this is one of them." He agreed, more out of curiosity than genuine hope, I suspected, and gave me access to his complete medical history. What I found, after hours of careful study alongside Dr. Sun, who had reluctantly agreed to assist despite her own reservations, was a condition that, while unique to his species, shared enough structural similarities with certain human cardiovascular failures that a modified version of a mechanical support system, adapted from equipment we routinely used for human patients, might be able to take over the function his failing organs could no longer perform. It would not be a permanent cure. It would, if it worked, buy him time, potentially years, while a longer-term solution could be developed. But it would require a procedure his people had never attempted, using equipment his physicians had never trusted, based on a theory that had never been tested on anyone of his species before. "This has never been done," Dr. Sun said, reviewing my proposed procedure with a mixture of fascination and deep concern. "Not on his species, Perhaps not on any species outside your own. That's true, I said, but the underlying principle is sound. The mechanics of what's failing aren't as different from human physiology as I initially expected. And if it fails? She asked. Then he's exactly where he already was, I said, except we'll have learned something that might help the next person in his position. I brought the proposal to Ambassador Kest personally, laying out both the potential benefit and the very real risk involved. He listened carefully, his advisors standing tensely behind him, several of them already voicing quiet objections before I had even finished speaking. This is not how my people approach the end of a life, one advisor said, an older Vantari named Ilsa Rowe, her voice sharp with disapproval. We do not fight against what has been accepted as inevitable. There is dignity in acceptance that this procedure would deny him. There's also dignity in fighting for more time, if he wants it, I said. That's his choice to make, not mine, and not yours. Ambassador Kest was quiet for a long moment, studying the proposal I had laid out before him. You are asking me to defy generations of my people's understanding of our own biology, he said finally, based on a theory developed over the course of a few hours, using equipment designed for an entirely different species. I am, I admitted. I won't pretend it's not a significant risk. But the alternative is certain. This gives you a chance, even if it's not a guaranteed one. And if I refuse? He asked. Then I respect that completely, I said. This is your life, and your choice. I'm not here to tell you what to do with either. I'm here to make sure you have every option available before you decide. He was quiet for a long time after that, longer than I expected, long enough that I began to suspect he had already made his decision and was simply working up to sharing it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard from him before. My people have a saying, he said. The wave that fights the shore only exhausts itself. We are taught, from a young age, that some things cannot be changed, only accepted with grace. He paused, looking down at his own hands, weathered and steady, despite the conditions slowly failing inside him. But I have spent my entire career negotiating change that others believed impossible. Perhaps it is time I applied that same stubbornness to my own circumstances. You'll do it? I asked. I will do it, he said. Not because I have stopped believing in acceptance, Dr. Bennett, but because I have come to believe that acceptance and effort are not always opposites. Sometimes trying is simply another form of accepting the responsibility of the life you have been given. The procedure took nearly 9 hours, longer than I had anticipated, complicated by the unfamiliar physiology and the constant, careful adjustments required to adapt equipment designed for an entirely different species. Dr. Sun assisted throughout, her initial reluctance giving way, hour by hour, to a focused, careful precision that reminded me, more than once, of exactly why she had earned her position as the station's senior physician. When the mechanical support system finally engaged, taking over the function of Ambassador Kest's failing organs, the monitor readings stabilized in a way that even I hadn't fully allowed myself to expect. His vital signs, which had been slowly declining for weeks, held steady, then, gradually, began to improve. He woke nearly 6 hours later, disoriented but coherent, his voice steadier than it had been in days. How do you feel? I asked, checking his readings one final time, before allowing myself to relax. Alive, he said simply. In a way I did not expect to feel again. The story of Ambassador Kest's recovery spread through the diplomatic community faster than almost anything before it, reaching ears far beyond Meridian Station, far beyond even the growing collection of stories that had already begun shaping the galaxy's understanding of human medicine. This time, the reaction was different from anything I had experienced before. It wasn't simple fear or simple gratitude. It was something closer to a fundamental reconsideration. Entire cultures forced to question long-held beliefs about what could, and could not, be treated, simply because a human doctor had refused to accept the word impossible when it came from someone else's tradition rather than her own. Ilsa Rowe, the advisor who had objected so strongly to the procedure, sought me out several days later, finding me in the small office attached to the medical bay. I owe you an apology, she said, her voice careful, measured. I believed you were disregarding our traditions out of arrogance. I understand now that you were simply offering a choice we had never considered possible. I wasn't trying to disregard anything, I said. I just didn't want him to lose the chance to decide for himself. That is, perhaps, the thing my people find most difficult to reconcile about your medicine, she admitted. You do not simply impose your solutions, you offer them, and then you step back, allowing the choice to remain with the patient, even when that choice defies everything we have been taught to accept. I thought about that observation for a long time afterward. It was true, I realized, in a way I hadn't fully articulated to myself before. Human medicine, whatever else it was, whatever fear or fascination it inspired across the species we now worked alongside, had never been about imposing certainty. It had been about expanding the range of choices available to the person whose life was actually on the line, even when those choices defied everything their own tradition had taught them to expect. That philosophy, more than the blood, more than the pain, more than even the willingness to stop a heart in order to save it, was, I was beginning to understand, the true source of the fear and fascination that followed human doctors across the stars. We didn't simply treat conditions. We refused to accept the boundaries other cultures had drawn around what medicine could and could not achieve, and in doing so, we forced entire civilizations to reconsider beliefs they had held for generations. It was a heavy kind of influence to carry, heavier than I had fully understood when I first arrived at Meridian Station, eager and confident and entirely unprepared for exactly how much my presence, and the presence of every human doctor working alongside me, would come to mean to the species who had never encountered anything quite like us before. Ambassador Kest recovered fully over the following months, eventually returning to his diplomatic duties with a renewed vigor that surprised even his closest advisors. He would go on to become one of the strongest advocates for expanding human medical involvement across galactic institutions, citing his own recovery as proof of exactly what could be achieved when a culture was willing to set aside its assumptions about what could and could not be treated. But even as his advocacy opened doors for human doctors across dozens of new postings, the underlying fear that had followed us since Kalen Thoss's recovery, since Celis Rowe's return from a stopped heart, since every difficult choice I had made in the chaos of that transport vessel disaster, never fully disappeared. If anything, it deepened, spreading alongside our growing reputation, until the two became almost impossible to separate. We were trusted, more and more, with the impossible cases, the ones every other tradition had already given up on. And we were feared, more and more, precisely because of how often we succeeded where everyone else had already decided success was no longer possible. I would carry both of those things with me for the rest of my career, among the stars, the trust and the fear, woven together so tightly that eventually I stopped trying to separate them at all. They had become, I realized, simply two sides of the same reputation, one that followed every human doctor who chose to serve beyond the borders of our home world, and one that, whether we liked it or not, we had all played some small part in building. Years have passed since Kalen Thoss was wheeled into my medical bay with his chest torn open, and 3 alien doctors too afraid to touch him. I am no longer the young, freshly transferred trauma surgeon who once hesitated for exactly 0 seconds before picking up a scalpel in front of an audience that had never seen anything like it. I have gray now, threading through hair that used to be entirely dark, and hands that have grown steadier with each passing year, even as the situations they've had to manage have grown steadier alongside them. I am telling you all of this, Nurse Eris Vell, because you asked me a question during your orientation this morning that deserves a proper answer, not the short version I gave you in the hallway between patients. You asked me why so many species across the galaxy still speak of human doctors the way some might speak of a controlled storm. Useful, necessary, and still, somehow, a little frightening, even after everything we've done to prove ourselves worthy of trust. I've thought about that question for a long time, longer than you probably expected when you asked it. I think the answer lives somewhere in everything I've told you over the past hour, scattered across every case that shaped my understanding of exactly what it means to practice medicine the way humans do. It's not that we're careless with life. If anything, the opposite is true. We take life so seriously that we refuse to let it go without exhausting every possible option first, even when those options require us to do things most other species were taught, from childhood, never to attempt. We cut into bodies that haven't given formal consent because waiting for consent sometimes means the difference between saving someone and losing them entirely. We stop hearts on purpose because sometimes stillness is the only path back to a steady, healthy rhythm. We endure pain, and we ask our patients to endure it too, when the alternative is worse than the discomfort itself. We make impossible choices in seconds, sorting through crisis after crisis, without letting the weight of those choices freeze us in place. And we refuse, again and again, to accept the word impossible, even when it comes wrapped in generations of another culture's most deeply held beliefs. None of that makes us reckless. It makes us determined, in a way that most species across the stars simply never needed to develop, because most of them never faced the particular kind of scarcity, urgency, and hardship that shaped human medicine long before any of us ever left our home world behind. I think about Kalen Thoss sometimes, walking out of my medical bay under his own power, using a word his own language didn't quite have a perfect translation for, storm healer. One who saves you by becoming, for a short time, something dangerous. I didn't fully understand what he meant back then. I understand it completely now. We are dangerous, in a very particular sense. Dangerous to hesitation. Dangerous to the idea that some things simply cannot be fixed. Dangerous to entire traditions built around gentleness and acceptance. Traditions that, however beautiful in their own right, sometimes cost lives that could have been saved if someone had simply been willing to try a little harder, a little faster, a little more stubbornly than tradition allowed. That danger, that refusal to accept limits drawn by anyone other than the patient themselves, is exactly why species across the galaxy have learned to dread human doctors, even as they continue requesting us, again and again, whenever the situation grows dire enough that gentler traditions no longer feel like enough. I don't think that fear will ever fully disappear, Eris, and I've come to believe that's probably for the best. Fear, in this particular case, isn't the opposite of trust. It's simply the shadow trust casts when it's placed in something powerful enough to be genuinely unpredictable. Every species we've worked alongside has learned, sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once, that human medicine doesn't operate within the same boundaries their own traditions have always respected. That unpredictability is unsettling. It's also, more often than any of us like to admit, exactly what saves the lives that everyone else had already given up on. You'll see it yourself, before long. You'll watch alien crew members flinch at procedures that feel completely ordinary to you. Procedures you learned in your very first year of training. You'll watch patients from a dozen different worlds request you specifically, not because your bedside manner is gentler than their own physicians, but because they've heard, through whatever version of the rumor network exists on whatever station you eventually find yourself posted to, that human doctors don't give up. And you'll watch some of those same patients hesitate before letting you near them, unsure whether they're more afraid of their condition or of what you might be willing to do in order to treat it. Both reactions are, in their own way, a form of respect. I've learned to accept that, even on the days when the fear feels heavier than the trust. Even on the days when an alien colleague looks at me the way Dr. Amos once did, caught somewhere between horror and reluctant admiration. The alarm in the medical bay is sounding again, right on cue, the way it always seems to whenever I find myself in the middle of explaining exactly why I do what I do. There's a patient arriving, critical condition, species I don't yet know, injury I haven't yet assessed. I imagine, whatever I find when those doors open, it will follow the same pattern it always has. Shock, from whoever is watching. Disbelief, when I don't hesitate. And then, eventually, once the crisis has passed and the patient is breathing steadily again, that same complicated mixture of gratitude and unease that has followed every human doctor who ever chose to practice medicine among the stars. I'm picking up my gloves now, Eris, and I'd invite you to follow if you're ready to see exactly what I've spent the last hour trying to explain. Not because I think it will make the fear disappear. I don't think it ever fully does. Not for the alien doctors who watch us work. And not, if I'm being honest, for us either. Not when the stakes are highest and the outcome is genuinely uncertain. But I've come to believe that fear, in this particular case, is simply the price of refusing to give up. Every civilization we've encountered has built its medicine around some version of acceptance, a belief that certain things simply cannot be changed, that certain endings simply must be allowed to happen exactly when and how they were always going to happen. Humanity never fully learned that lesson, not the way everyone else did, and I don't think we ever will. We learned a different lesson instead, one shaped by scarcity, urgency, and an entire history of refusing to let go of people who still had a chance, however small, however difficult, however far outside the boundaries anyone else had drawn. That's why they dread us, Eris. Not because we're careless, and not because we take any pleasure in the fear our methods inspire. They dread us because we never stop trying, and because, more often than any of us really deserve credit for, that stubborn refusal to give up turns out to be exactly what the moment required. The doors to the medical bay are opening now. Whatever is waiting on the other side, I already know what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick up my instruments, and I'm going to try. That's all we've ever done. That's all we'll ever do. And somewhere out among the stars, in languages I'll never fully learn to speak, an entire galaxy will keep whispering the same uneasy truth it has whispered since the very first human doctor stepped through an airlock and refused to accept that some things simply couldn't be fixed. They will keep calling us when everything else has failed, and they will keep dreading the moment we say yes.